All right, here we are, back together in the shed of knowledge. I'm your old pal, John the Storyteller, and you've tuned in because it's been a while since you heard something that you didn't know. So I'm hoping to enlighten you on some aspect of history or something that is unusual, something that is not generally in the realm of common knowledge. And on top of that is interesting. That's why we call this segment Something Interesting. So I'm going to come up with something interesting. Today, we're going to go back to World War II. Now wait, don't turn it off. I know I do a lot of World War II stuff. I'm going to concentrate on the civilian aspect of World War II and a little bit of post-war stuff that was kind of interesting internationally. I'm speaking specifically about the scrap metal drives of the 40s. During World War II, the average citizen was expected to participate and help out the war effort. This is not anything probably that you're unfamiliar with. You've heard of maybe victory gardens. That's where you were encouraged to grow your own food and make a little garden to feed your family or to at least offset your food usage, so that if you grew potatoes in your backyard, then the rest of the potatoes could go to the troops overseas. There were massive scrap metal drives. People gave their pots and their pans and in some cases decorative fences and bicycles and their lawn furniture. Whatever was made out of metal could go for the war effort. A lot of that went straight into making bombs and tanks, and all the car companies, for example, geared up to make things for the war effort. General Motors made pretty much everything. Ford as well. Chrysler made tanks. Packard, which is the car company that I'm going to talk specifically about. As a car collector, which I do not own any exotic cars anymore because real life got in the way, but I used to own a 1949 Packard Super 8. That's the main one that I owned. I owned it for 14 years. It was a great car, great looking car anyway. Cars of the 40s were not necessarily reliable vehicles by our standards today, but it drove pretty much like a modern car. 3 on the tree, shifted on the tree. Anyway, long story short, I owned a couple other Packards too, but not in the condition that this 49 was. But Packard Motor Company made radial engines for aircraft. After the war, they made private engines for private aircraft as well. After the war, you had a lot of guys coming back that were trained aviators. They were pilots or co-pilots or navigators. They were interested in aviation in some way. So private aviation, they wanted to continue to fly, and private aviation took off. There's companies like Piper that made a little airplane called the Piper Cub. This was an inexpensive airplane that maybe an average guy could afford and could fly around and continue his love of aviation. Packard made radial engines for aircraft during the war, and then they continued to make them after the war. Packard also made big engines for PT boats as well. But I'm going to talk about Packard. And one of the reasons that I'm going to talk about Packard is because Packard kind of got snowed during the war by the Soviets, and I'll tell you how that happened. Packard also got in big trouble after the war because they were expecting to have defense contracts after the war, and they were going to make only 40% of their business was going to be automobiles. The rest of it, they were geared up to make stuff for defense departments, engines and things like that. So after the war, the Secretary of Defense that was appointed was a former GM executive. So guess what? GM got all the defense contracts and Packard didn't get anything. And all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, our cars are outdated. We don't have a V8. We don't have, you know what I mean? Their cars looked dated. They still had fenders and things like that. So it took them a little while to get kind of caught up and in the mainstream. And of course, Packard, the last, I would say, real Packard, I'm sorry if I offended anybody who's a Packard Baker fan, but the last real Packard was produced in 1955. Packard then merged with Studebaker. Studebaker was in worse financial shape than Packard, and Packard continued to make cars, or Studebaker actually made the Packards and put the name Packard on them until 1958. It was a Packard Hawk, which looked exactly like a Studebaker Hawk. Just look all this stuff up. This isn't part of the story. It's just a little backstory. Studebaker continued to make cars until 1966 under the name of Studebaker, but the Studebaker Avanti was made until 1993, and then later on, the Avanti name continued up until it looks like it should be kind of flat out. It's like, no, they stopped in 2002, but the production was a little weird, and so some of the cars never got made that were for a model year that was supposed to be after that it just never happened. A lot of them had Ford Mustang parts in them, so they weren't a true Avanti anymore. Anyway, Avanti Motors. I think Avanti Motors' website is still up, and it has pictures of the Avanti, but it didn't hang around too long. But yeah, so Studebaker in some incarnation was around until 1993. People don't realize that. People don't even realize that, like, for example, old names like Hudson and Nash are still around in the form of Chrysler Corporation. Hudson and Nash merged to form American Motors, AMC. You remember those from the 70s? They had the Matador and the Gremlin and some of these cars that were kind of the Pacer, that were kind of a little bit jokey cars. But they also merged with another car company that was originally Willis Overland. They became Willys and is now known as Jeep. And Chrysler bought Jeep, Chrysler bought American Motors, and so Hudson and Nash in some ways still around. It's not the point of what I'm trying to say here, but car companies are kind of interesting. Our idea of a luxury car today would be Lincoln, Lexus, Cadillac, BMW, Mercedes. Back then, it would have been, Packard was a big car. Lincoln was Ford's big car, and Cadillac obviously was the Cadillac of cars, and I guess always has been. But long story short, I was talking about the metal scrap drives. Packard also participated in the metal scrap drives. Being a maker of cars, they had a lot of metal in their factories, and so they donated the molds, which were big, heavy metal molds for fenders and body parts that they would pour the molten metal in and make Packards out of. And they donated all those that they had laying around from previous models of the 30s, models of the early 40s that were not being produced anymore. They donated those, and somehow that metal got into the hands of the Soviets. Soviets were our allies, so theoretically that metal, and by the way, this isn't just like one mold, this is many molds, because there's many parts of a car and many cars being produced at once. So these molds got into the hands of the Soviets. Theoretically, it was so that the Soviets could melt them down and make tanks out of them to fight the Nazis, who were our enemies, in case you don't know anything about World War II. Well, the Soviets did get hold of the molds, and suspiciously enough, after the war was over, a Soviet car company called ZIL, or ZIL, I guess you would pronounce it, started producing cars that looked exactly like pre-war Packards. So the moral of the story is, whenever you give somebody something, you don't exactly know what they're going to do with it. The Soviets obviously took these molds and said, oh, this is an American engineered car, we're going to produce these things. So if you look at post-war Soviet cars, they look like pre-war Packards. That's something interesting. Thank you for tuning in. I'll have another quick something interesting later.